This is a class I'm doing about once a month with members of my congregation. I did a grief share class in my church, and I noticed that while many of the people were there at the class because they were grieving a lost parent, a lost spouse, some other loss in their life, I began to notice how many of the people in the class were dealing with a child, an adult child, who was dependent upon them. And these relationships were causing a fair amount of distress, and I began to think about the fact that many people in my congregation have situations where their biggest anxiety is over their adult children. And I remembered a comment that a therapist once made to me that, there's books about teaching people how to parent young people and how to parent teenagers, but there's almost nothing about parenting adult children. And so then I decided to just, take my own shot at it. And so I have this little class, Parenting Through Adulthood. Now, and then my class asked me, I went through a bunch of the sessions, and you can find them, they're all on the playlist. And they said, well, we'd like you to talk about grandparenting. And now I've got 5 kids, and I'm by no means consider myself an expert. My oldest child is 27, and my youngest is 17. So, I haven't been through all the stages yet, and I don't consider myself a stellar model parent by any stretch of the imagination. But then they say, well, let's talk about grandparenting. I'm thinking, I don't have any grandchildren. I have zero experience with this. I haven't really read much about it, so. You might get to the end of this and say, this putz doesn't know anything. So, well, sorry for your half hour, but here goes. A more recent problem with growing up in the culture today. Now men and women have it different with this. Women have a biological clock that is both a blessing and a curse, as most things are. And women are on average temperamentally disposed to both sides of care. And one of the side of care is caregiving, being a nurturer, looking to care for someone or something, and then care as worry. And they're prone to want to mother, and they have a limited window of doing that. Now that gets important because so often we raise our children and our children raise us. I heard a young single man in his early 30s in a group that I was leading the other day talking about some of his younger siblings he's single man, some of his younger siblings who have married and have kids, and he looks at them and he's like, wow, they're more mature than I am. Well, those kids will make you mature. Those kids will teach you how selfish you are. Those kids will force you to grow and develop in ways that you don't want to. And that's usually what growing up involves. Growing up involves making choices and living our lives in ways that we don't want to. It's a pretty good definition of growing up. And so in many ways, women in our culture are forced to grow up quicker than men and boys. And women mature earlier. You see that. I was just at a junior high play last night. You can see the girls are taller and more developed. The boys are younger. They look more like boys. This is biological. This is also relational. Relationally, the girls are way ahead of the boys. Well, that continues. Women in some ways don't have the kind of luxuries boys and men do with respect to this in these ways. Now, they have other liabilities. And the world has changed dramatically over the last 100 some odd years. Urbanization. Throughout the 20th century, the transition happened that more people live in cities than don't live in cities. And industrialization, machine power has replaced manpower, and quite literally manpower, because men are, again, this is a biological fact, men are genetically, biologically disposed to be stronger, and so for all of human history, men have done the majority of strong physical labor. Men have fought wars. We call it manpower because it's usually the men that do this kind of work, and biologically the women do other kinds of work. And now through most of human history, men and women have been working until the day we drop dead. But there's been differentiation and specialization, and this has happened. But now through the 20th century, Machines have replaced what men have done. When I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic, if you wanted to dig a ditch, I remember in a certain area of the city, they were putting in sewers. They had rows of Haitians with picks and shovels. And in the United States, you'd have someone with an excavator or a backhoe doing all of that work. You'd have one man, usually with a big belly, sitting there with his controls doing this stuff. But in the Dominican Republic, we had rows of Haitians. And if you look at these guys, they were strong. Their shoulders were developed. They were young. They were, they were full of muscles because this is what they were doing all day long. Well, why didn't they use an excavator in the Dominican Republic? Because excavators break down, and because of economics, it was cheaper to have 30 Haitians do what one excavator could do. And now we're entering we're in the information revolution, and we don't know all the kinds of jobs that are going to be replaced, but this is one of the things that we've seen, that skewing up the IQ range now. The Army won't take in people under a certain IQ level because the Army can't find a job for them to do. And you'd think, well, give them a gun and have them run at the enemy and get shot. Yeah, but that's not even an efficient way for the Army to use people. I think the Chinese and the Russians demonstrated that in the Second World War and in the Korean War. Human wave attacks only work if you don't actually care about human beings and you don't care about your population, and even you don't care about the battle, because one guy in a machine gun is going to mow down a whole bunch of them, and you need someone who can set the machine gun properly and figure out where to fire and manage the whole technological side. Now, increasingly, there's a lot of conversation about truck drivers and taxi drivers being replaced, and lawyers being replaced, and doctors being replaced. And we really don't know where this whole revolution is going, but it's going. Because you make more money with your brain than you make with your brawn or with violence. And one of the other things that we've seen is affluence. I've heard it said that before the 20th century, the vast majority of the world lived on less than $1 a day in our money. And I believe it, because the difference between the developed world and the undeveloped world is just that. The undeveloped world, in many ways, and many places, are living in those old frames of reference, which is why you had 30 Haitians digging that ditch instead of one guy with an excavator, even though excavators have been around for a long time. The transition has not happened. Well, some of you listening to this, grandparent age and great-grandparent age and great-great-grandparent age in a few of your cases, the world has changed, and you've seen this change with your own eyes, and these changes have impacted families. Now, here is the Vanderklay family, and I figure this picture was taken about summer 1910, and the patriarch of the family here, Hartog, is at this point not quite, he's in his 70s still, and he and his wife, who was there in front of him, had 7 kids total. He got all of them to America eventually. 2 of them died when they were quite young. Saka here, my great-grandfather, is in the middle of the family, and he dies in 1932 at the age of 58. This is my grandfather here, born in 1904. Hartog's wife will die at 78. Hartog himself will live all the way to 93. Hartog will outlive his wife and all of his children except for his youngest daughter, who is not in this picture. Saka came to America. Hartog sends him in 1893, I believe, and he's 18 years old. And his father probably gives him some money and says, go to Rotterdam, get on a boat, go to America, find a place for us to live, and get us ready. And when I think about, I have a son that just turned 18, and when I think about what would the world have to be like for me to hand him a pile of cash and to say, go to another continent, to a country where none of us speak the language, and where you don't know, maybe you don't know any people, and go set up residence so that me and your mom and your brothers and sisters, who are all probably around the same age, similar to the age that Hartog's kids were at that point, and go get us a residence in that country. An 18-year-old? My son? Now, my son Ben is I think mature beyond his years. I think he's got a good head on his shoulders. I love the kid to death, but it would scare me to death to make such a move. Well, that's exactly the move that Hartog made, and Saka came to America, and he had to set this up, and then he met Katie, and they got married, and they got busy with kids. 1902, 1904, 1906. She only lived till 10 years old. 1908, 1910. By the time this picture is taken, Katie is pregnant with their 6th child, and she will die in childbirth bearing that 6th child just a few months from when this picture is taken, which is probably why the picture was preserved and set down in the family, because this was her last picture, and there weren't a lot of pictures taken. Now then, Saka had a real problem, because he had 6 children, all under age 9, including a newborn and a 1-year-old, and he was a painter, or a decorator, as some of the old census things say, and he had to figure out what to do. Well, Katie had a brother who died in 1904, who married a woman in 1902. The first son they had died. The second daughter they had was just a newborn when her brother died. And so that woman comes to live with Saka and in 1911, and she's their housekeeper for 3 years, and then they marry in 1914, and they move from this rural community to Grand Rapids, Michigan. And that's where my grandfather will do the rest of his growing up and meet my grandmother, and on and on and on the story goes. But look at how the world has changed. Now, when Hartog sent Saka, put him on a boat in Rotterdam, probably with whatever money they had, and said, go through Ellis Island, go find a place for us to live, and once you get settled, bring the rest of us there. What did that do to Saka? That grew him up. Now, a majority of men do not reproduce. A majority of women do. And you can see that, it sounds awful Darwinian, but boy, a tough world, a difficult world makes tough, mature people who know how to make decisions, know how to be self-reliant, and do the right thing. Now, one of the things, growing up the way I did in an African-American community, black boys and men in America have been in trouble for a long time. And I will argue that these things go all the way back into slavery, and the dislocation that slavery put into those communities and embedded in those communities that even hundreds of years haven't been able to fully shake in many cases. Slavery valued them for physical labor. Slavery didn't value them as heads of households, and slavery fractured family systems. Slavery valued them for breeding new slaves, but not for fathering. Urbanization, dislocation, and immigration have made matters worse, and matriarchy in the African American community has been a coping mechanism. And one of the interesting things that has happened is that this malaise, instead of the United States actually figuring out how to help black men and boys, and help the African American family become re-knit together, actually the problems have spread, and they've spread in many ways to the white population. It's interesting, I noted in a book that suicide rates for every group of people except black men have been rising. And my theory for, well, why not black men? Well, because it's always been bad for them. And lower life expectancy among many white men right now. And that, in fact, for white men, life expectancy is declining, which is kind of a crazy thing, especially for poorly employed, relatively unskilled, relatively uneducated, relatively poor white men. Unemployment and underemployment are increasing in this population group. That used to be kind of the majority strong population group, the so-called privileged population group. Loss of good industrial jobs that pay a living wage. Back when I was growing up, if someone in northern New Jersey was working for General Motors, they were making a good wage that you could support a family on, and the wife wouldn't have to go out and work. Those jobs are not like it was, even for many white-collar workers now. You need a 2-income family in California to make it work. Trade jobs are good, but competition, there's a lot of competition with immigration and status issues. In fact, one of the members of our church who works for an organization training journeyman electricians, which is an excellent, well-paying trade. They have open positions in their school. They can't get enough students that can actually be a student, that can show up for school every day, that will dedicate themselves to work. And so the issue isn't opportunity. The issue is inside these young men. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what are we doing as a culture? One of the issues is that porn and the pill have changed the sexual economy. Sex is cheaper, more out of wedlock children. Marriage is increasingly, I have that in a slide coming up, marriage is increasingly a function of if you're part of a strict religious group that has some community coherence, or if you have wealth. The other groups, marriage is in decline. Now, even in our schools are very boy unfriendly. Boys need rough and tumble play. And boys that don't get that develop ADHD, and we see the rise in ADHD. Boys need practice in controlled aggression. When boys are aggressive, they tend to be aggressive physically. When girls are aggressive, they tend to be aggressive reputationally. These are the two ways the two sexes express aggression. And so this is why, and many of you know this is why sports are so helpful, especially for boys, because they need to be out there on the basketball court or the football field, and they need to, in a sense, be violent, they need to be rough, but when you get up at the end of the play, you don't look across and curse your enemy or take out a knife and stab him. At the end of the game, you line up and you shake hands and you say, good game, good game. And for a lot of those little boys, boy, that's hard, because boy, they're hurting, and boy, but this is all training in what it means to be a man. This is all training in growing up. And right now we as a society have become so blind to what is so obvious that you just don't talk people into being something else. You have to practice it in your bodies. And we've known this psychologically for a long time, but we can't get it into our heads when it comes to our schools. And our conversations about gender are not helping us. Women right now dominate colleges. There are more women in college than men in college, and women are getting more degrees than men are, and women are getting better degrees than men are, and they're at higher rates. Now you might say, yeah, but the very top layer of, say, the business world and the political world is still tending to go to men, and that's a really good question. There are a lot of theories about it, and one of the theories, which I tend to think has some merit, is that that's because of workaholism. Most women are too smart to give in to workaholism. Most men aren't. And so men, in order to get these absolutely highest paying, top tier competitive jobs, you have to work and 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 sacrifice family and sacrifice marriage and sacrifice relationship and sacrifice all of that. Most women are unwilling to do that, and most men do, and actually most women who are unwilling to do so benefit from it, and most men who are willing to do so suffer from it. And so this is also part of the issue of alcoholism and drug addiction and suicide in men. Now, let's talk about adulting. Now, this is a word that has crept into our vocabulary. Historically, the pattern of growing up means to leave and cleave, and this is right there in the book of Genesis. A man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. You leave your home of origin and you go out and you start a new family with a strange woman, and some are stranger than others. And marriage is increasingly a thing that is afforded by the religious and the wealthy. Marriage rates are getting later and later. It's only religious communities where people are continuing to marry young. And there's actually a very hot debate about the upsides and downsides between marrying young and marrying later, because what's happening in terms of those who marry later is they have this unmarried sex life and they have periods of different cohabitation, and then they marry, and almost all studies will show that this period that they have before they marry later is not helpful to being married later. And in fact, the experiences they have through this do harm to the marriage later. People who have lived together before they are married divorce at a higher rate than people who marry young and stay young. Now, that doesn't mean it always works out, but statistically, that's where the facts are. Increasingly our economy is, careers are gone and the gig economy is here. And so stand on your own 2 feet. It's, in a sense, we had a culture that helped give baby steps to people too. You get out of college, you get your little entry-level job, and that leads to another job, and it leads to another job, and you kind of had smaller steps, and you can put your career together. Well, the steps are bigger now. And what that means is that more people are failing to make it onto that first step and then get up and go. And partly because of the way things are going with a variety of different conversations, men are having a more difficult time with that first step. Again, we began talking about biologically, women grow up faster, and just by virtue of reproduction and a variety of other things, the way society is skewing now, those relational skills that girls develop earlier, those relational skills that girls develop, these are all much more germane in the marketplace than the kind of skills that, basketball playing, football playing men who, don't have their relational stuff together, aren't completely mature, even mentally, physically yet. Those aren't male skills. Those aren't masculine skills. Those tend to be feminine skills. And so boys are having a harder time. And then you have the cost of living of housing in California, which is very large. And so actually, in preparation of this, I sat down and I kind of thought about all of the different issues that I hear about within the congregation and outside the congregation of who's struggling with whom. And it came as no surprise that many of those that some of you are dealing with in terms of your adult children struggling, many of these are men, and the men are struggling in different ways. And so you have failures. You have failure to launch, men not entering the workforce, men not marrying. You have failure to recover. Most people will, at some point in their life, suffer a major setback. That could be a job loss, it could be a divorce, it could be an illness, it could be a financial setback, something like this. And many have had this kind of stumble, and then they're able to recover and get on in life. And in fact, when many talk about their lives, they will talk about, boy, that setback was really important because I learned a ton through that. And I was able to take that learning and, that really helped me propel and get to where I needed to go. And, but what happens if you can't recover from that setback? And it's often in one of these setbacks that someone will move back into the home of their parents. And how does that transition go? And if you can't recover, you will tend to stay living with your parents. And when then the setbacks become permanent and there's no recovery, well, that's just a difficult recipe. And then other behavioral and reputational and relational things can become habit, where what was supposed to be and this happens a lot, what was supposed to be a temporary plan to just survive until I can recover and get on my feet. We have that kind of language. Problem is, those places can become traps, and you might never get on your feet, or your son and your daughter might never get on their feet. And now we've got other dynamics happening in the house that, the parents like having them there, or, so on and so forth. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In many cultures, extended families of multi-generations live together. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but you have to look at the picture as a whole, and you have to always ask yourself, am I helping them towards the longer goal of their independence and thriving? Those are very difficult questions. So what we have now are elderly backstops. And part of what's happened in our culture is that when it comes to the elderly, people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, economically for that group, it's feast or famine. And what you see is polarization in that group. You'll have your wealthiest individuals in America and your poorest individuals in America in that age group. The middle gets weaned out because what was what was earlier on in their lives, kind of the economic trends, now suddenly at the end, there it is. It's divided. And so now when those who have stumbled come home, now you've got different dynamics in the home. If the parents and grandparents have a lot of resources, well, now they've got to make decisions about these resources. Should I bail them out? Should I give them this loan? Now, those who have fewer resources, they don't have those kinds of problems. They don't have it to give, but they've got other challenges to face. Should I let them live here? Do I need them living with me just so that I can make the rent? And again, that's not in itself a bad thing, but you have to ask the questions, is this living situation finally helping my son or grandson in the long run? Failed launchers or recoverers land in aging parents' homes. How do you let your kid hit bottom? And what kind of bottom do they hit? And if someone is stumbling in their 40s and 50s, that's a lot different than if they're stumbling in their 20s and 30s. And so these are the issues that we're looking at. One of the things we're also looking at is the loss of Christendom. The church has been in decline for 2 successive generations. Now, the high point of American church attendance was during the Cold War in the 1950s and 1960s and dribbled into the 1970s, because really the height of the Cold War goes through the 70s and through the Vietnam era. And that's the height of American church participation. And since that point, American church attendance and the influence of traditional Christianity in America has been leading a long and steady retreat. Now, how does that figure into the story? Well, culturally in the blue states like California, there's an assault on traditional values, and that's I don't want you to hear me say that as if I'm, say, a red state culture warrior, but because the conversation with these values is far more nuanced and complicated than just that low resolution description reveals. Some churches hold out, and so what you get is polarization. They tend to go further to the right. Some churches try to accommodate. They tend to go further to the left. But they're both responding to changes in the culture. Now, again, most of you know the Ward and June Cleaver mentality, which was the kind of the traditional set of assumptions in terms of the normal path of growing up. You are a boy or a girl, and that you get an education, and then you arise in your education, and then you get a job. About the same time you get married, you have kids of your own, and boom, 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 boom. Now, it's helpful to notice that this situation hasn't always been quite as stable as the 1950s projection tends to lead us to believe. If you go further back in history, there's plenty of ups and downs in this, and there's plenty of changes. Before I showed you the picture of Hartog and his wife. His wife was actually 5 years older than him when they married. And the Saka's second wife will be 2 years older than him when they marry. So there's always a lot of variations and variables going on. But we're seeing the decline in these assumptions, and remember Murphy Brown having her baby out of wedlock in the 80s. More and more, well, I can define a family any way I want it, and now it's more I can define my own gender any way I want to. The breakdown of all this stuff, whichever way you think about it, adds complexity. And for many of us, complexity doesn't breed opportunity. It tends to breed confusion. And so this is what young people are living in the midst of. And whereas if you had a clear standard before, it was either I hit it or I don't. And you might celebrate if you hit it, and you might be punished if you don't, but at least there was a clear standard. And now there's multiple standards, and that might be seen as, oh, good, there's multiple points of entry. And in that way, it's an accommodation to the complexity that, well, I can take this alternate path and still be celebrated for it and still make accommodation and survive. Okay. But it also means that there's a lot more choice involved. And when there's complexity, if people have a clear goal, they tend to try to hit it. But if there's multiple goals, often people don't hit any goal, or they go halfway to one and then halfway to another and halfway to another, and then they don't actually accomplish anything. And so and I don't want to let red states off the hook here either, because lots of stuff is happening in the midst of their change too. They're just accommodating in different ways. So here's a really good phrase that will help. Rhythm replaces strength. The way we learn to drive a car is that when you first learn to drive a car, oh, there's so many things to watch, there's so many things to do, there's so many things to see. The more you practice at it, the more it becomes natural. The unconscious part of your brain absorbs the information, and that part of our brain is actually very good at managing lots of information via patterns and doing this. I was having lunch with a guy, and he said, I forget what the number was, but he said, self-driving cars have to process something like 6 gigabytes of data a second. I mean, just crazy amount. And our brains do this all by themselves, and we don't even think about it. It's the same learning the violin when you're in first grade like I did. I'll never forget some of this stuff in the violin because I've learned it young. Rhythm replaces strength. Now, stability in childhood helps train the adult. And this is why in many times when traditional peoples immigrate to America, they outperform Americans because they've had stability. It might not be the greatest stability. It might be in the undeveloped world. It probably was. But at least they've had relational stability of some kind, and that helps. Or they've just had desperation, and that focuses. Repetitive, healthy habits ground adults. And this is why if you grew up in a household where your parents enforced a bedtime, where you had regular meal schedules, where the families ate together, every week the family went to church, every week the children went to Sunday school, these patterns, what they did psychologically for the children was help them realize that I go to work every day. I do a job that I maybe don't like, but this actually helps us function. If, in fact, you don't have those routines in you, it's like, I don't feel like going to work today. The boss would say, great, you don't have to come into work tomorrow. Well, why not? Well, because, you know what? This is what I want from you. And if you can't do it, I won't have you. And I can find someone else who was raised in a better home with more structure who will come into work, and I will actually reward them, and they will probably climb up the hierarchy. And this person who's just doing what they feel like, they don't get anywhere. Now, do you recognize that in your kids and your grandkids? The consumerist impulse to do what I feel like, not what I must, is so deeply in our culture now. And this, again, is a function of the affluence. But it erodes healthy maintenance of body and spirit and mind. And the difficulty is it's far harder to learn these things in adulthood. I should have gone to live in a Spanish-speaking country in my teens rather than my 20s because, I would have learned Spanish far better the younger you do. You can tell this with almost any immigrant here, that if they came over when they were 1 or 2, they speak English perfectly. If they came over when they were 5 or 6, they speak English very well. And there'll be just a few tiny little things if you're paying attention. If they came over in their teens, they're never going to get rid of that accent. If they came over in their 20s, they're never really going to integrate well. It's going to be difficult for them to integrate well into American society as a group. There'll always be some outliers that do it well, but the majority of them will stick to their own cultural linguistic group. This is biology and psychology, and we've known this for a long time, but it doesn't just impact immigrants, it impacts all these other areas of life. And so when you look at your children and your grandchildren and you begin to say, why don't they just go to church every week? Even though they say, oh yeah, I really want to go to church. And they weren't raised with the kind of rigid structure you were. They weren't given that one single focus that they simply had to hit. And to now do this later is so much harder. Rhythm replaces strength. Now to grandparenting. This is what you've got. You've got wisdom from an older age. You remember how the world used to be. Now, there's always upsides and downsides with this. And there are some ways that you can look at and say, boy, the world is much better today than it was then. And praise God for that. But there are other ways that you look at and say, you know what? We've lost some things. And we are suffering because of those losses. Now, unfortunately, our culture is no longer revering you and seeking out your wisdom. Our culture has, in a sense, turned on its own head, and it doesn't value the old or their wisdom or anything like that, and it won't seek you out necessarily, which means what you have to do is model and explain. Now, as I've said in previous classes, avoid nagging. You are not just going to talk this into them. You are going to have to live a different life to the degree, and this isn't very different from Christian witnessing, you're going to have to live a different life to a degree that whether or not they talk to you about it, whether or not they know it, you model something. And now part of being a human being means that, in a sense, our brains are always watching, and we've got this little sense of our conscious selves that watch, but we've got, in a sense, all these other watchers in the back of our heads that are watching. And when you live the right way, when you model what it is you want to teach, those watchers are watching. And at some critical moment in the future, you may not even be there to see it. At some critical moment in the future, they're going to say, you know what? Remember when Grandma used to say this? Remember when Grandpa used to say that? There was something to that. And I didn't appreciate that. Now, I dare bet every one of you can tell a story like that. Because here's the benefit of age. You remember even further back generations, and they had things to teach us that we have lost, and that is in your mind. And so I would also suggest that you tell your stories. Now, telling your stories is different than nagging. And actually telling stories is a kind of a natural part of getting older. Older people tend to tell their stories. They like telling stories. Well, I think that's actually something that's built into us to help us, because those younger people need to hear your stories. And when the younger members of the family, I'm going to add this into the outline. So one of the things that you should do is record your stories, write a memoir, get your, we have recording opportunities all the time. Get your stories on YouTube. Get your stories on videotape. Get your stories on cassette tape. Get your stories down for the next generation and get them in a way that they won't lose them. And that way, when they get into the chaos of this life and they think about you, they might say, what can I learn from them? Make sure those stories are available. Let natural consequences and their pain motivate. Sometimes you got to hit rock bottom. Sometimes things won't change until this bad way of living finally yields its bitter fruit. And when they're sick and tired of eating that bitter fruit, then they'll be ready to seriously change. Don't get codependent and intervene and keep them from the consequences. Now, that's a really hard thing to know when to do. And there's no set rule that I can tell you, when is this enabling? When is this helping? You're going to have to figure it out, and you're going to have to figure it out with them, and you're going to get it wrong a lot of times. And so the main thing is you have to bear witness to being an alternative, and you're going to have to work this through. And as I said in the first lesson, in a lot of ways, what I think the Christian life boils down to is how much pain can you tolerate? That sounds weird, but I think it's true. This course has always been about using the gospel to endure your pain. Now, if you watch almost any movie, there's usually the hero, and then there's the hero's love interest, and then there's the villain. Well, the villain pretty quickly figures out that the way to change the hero's behavior is by threatening the love interest. Because if you threaten the hero will be the hero and say, "Go ahead, cut me." The villain's not dumb, says, "Hey, I know you'll say that. I'm going to cut your love interest." And then the hero caves. Love is stronger than death. And there you have it. It's what the Bible says. And so what you need to do in terms of your relationships with your children and grandchildren are you need to be able to endure pain. Well, what kind of pain? Well, the pain of watching them fail, the pain of watching, maybe in some cases, of them being homeless, the pain of watching them go through the humiliating process of rehab, the pain of them maybe being in a psychiatric hospital. And again, seriously, the pain of maybe them being homeless. Now, there's different levels of that. Most people, when they get homeless, they're homeless for a short time, and they get their snoot of it, and never again, and they turn their life around. There's another group of people that stay stuck homeless, and that's, again, a different thing. And I'm not trying to give out easy pills for things. And again, there's no answer, there's no easy answers here, but the skills you need, because you can't make these decisions for them, you need to be able to endure pain. And you will probably most often enable when you can't tolerate seeing the pain and cost and consequence of their poor decisions. That's the growing area you are going to need to work on. The greatest pains will be to watch your children and your grandchildren fail and stumble and even in some cases die. But now again, this is where being a Christian is really helpful, because God is better than we are. God is more merciful than we are. God is more wise than we are. So if you lose a loved one to death, if you're a Christian, that's not the end of the story. And God will know what to do. And so we trust him with that. But don't enable. Find and maintain boundaries. And again, as we've talked about this in our past classes, the order of the lost world was disciplined by depravity. Again, when you think of that picture I showed you of the Vanderklay family in 1910, the depravity and scarcity disciplined them to grow them up and to do the kinds of challenging things that they did. Don't disrupt the natural cycle, but instead you're going to have to be wise as serpents and figure out, now how can I turn small wins into big wins? And how can I not interrupt the natural process of pain that they might need? And don't do this alone. You're reaching an age when you need to depend on probably your most able children. So don't do this alone. Seek wise counsel. Try things out. And when you fail, try something else. Just try to stay out of ruts. Let siblings discipline each other. Siblings do that better than the parents do, because when a parent tries to discipline, there's all these psychological reasons why that can get all tangled. There's fewer when siblings do it. Siblings can be far harder on each other in a far cleaner way than parents can. And so let the siblings work some stuff out with each other. Help wisely. Ask for help when you need it. Being needed is what really grows us up. And so here's again where those who have will get even more. If you're a wise grandparent, you will get wiser still in the process of dealing with your struggling children and grandchildren, because children raise their parents too. Ask for peers for advice. There's not always black and white answers to your question. Don't struggle alone. Get help. When you make a mistake, try not to repeat it or live within it. Watch out for ruts. You want to see, and again, this all requires wisdom. Sometimes you need to wait, and someone might be stuck in a place for years, and you have to decide, am I waiting for them to figure it out, and maybe waiting will get them out of it, or maybe something will come into their life and that'll force them out of it, or maybe you need to intervene. And there's no clear answers for that, but work your resources, get advice, get help, try things. Remember, your job is to ready the next generation to live without you. Your job is to help them be better when you're gone, which is why you should record your stories, why you should write that memoir, why you should sit down in front of a camera and put it on YouTube, or keep it private and just share it Share it with videos, but find a way to preserve your record and preserve your story and preserve your wisdom. Questions for discussion. What changes have you seen in your lifetime in adulting? What hardships drove you to grow up? Tell those stories. What do you remember learning from the 2 generations before you? Because these generations don't have access to them. Get those stories down, share them, rehearse them, tell them. What do you most want to leave your children and your grandchildren? Might be your faith. Prioritize that. And again, not by nagging, but by inviting and modeling and sharing your story. What strategies can you have to leave it to them? I don't know if this will be the last of the Parenting Through Adulthood classes. I'm going to ask the class if they seem to like this format. We go out to, I know this is very un-Christian reformed of us, we go out to our restaurant after church on Sunday, and we have our little class together, about 10 of us. And so maybe we'll do a different class after this. Again, the people seem to like the format and the combination of the video and website and all that stuff. And so maybe we'll keep doing some other classes with this. Let me know if this has been helpful for you. Thank you.